It's Sunday, November 8th, 2020.
In 1/2 mile, be in the right lane, then turn right before the Lukoil.
And I'm in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. Just pulled out of my hotel parking lot. And I'm heading for the Valley Forge National Park, or Valley Forge National Historic Monument. I think it seems to have two names. Not quite sure how that works.
North Gulf Road.
It's a very built-up area. Website says the visitor center is closed and there's no tours or anything, but you can apparently buy from their online store live streaming self-guided car tour of the national park that takes about 2 hours. That sounds about right to me. It's about what I have time and enthusiasm for this morning. I want to spend most of the day driving westwards through Pennsylvania on the turnpike, hopefully enjoying some fall colors and some nice forested hills. The turnpike is just right over here on the side of me. Should be not too long after we pass under Interstate 276, which is this right up here. Valley Forge National Historic Park. Next right. They mean next right? They put it before this intersection. That would technically be the next right. Now there's a sign saying go straight, but this is the next right. There's a casino there. I think somebody needs to update their signs. Pass under US Highway 422. And the road gets a lot smaller.
In 1/4 mile, turn left on West Valley Forge Road. Turn left at the traffic light.
Okay. Visitor information and parking.
1/4 mile. Turn left on North Outer Line Drive, then take the first left.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Visitor center is closed.
Turn left on North Outer Line Drive, then take the first left.
Looks like a lot of people are just using this parking lot down here to use the jogging trail.
It demands that he attack the British with the needs of his worn and poorly supplied army. After much deliberation, Washington chooses this site. From here, he can protect Congress and American refugees from the British, as well as be near the vital food and military supplies nearby throughout the countryside.
The driving tour's streaming audio is now directing me to pull off into the parking lot at Tours Stop 2 for the Muhlenberg Brigade, as it's called on the map. And after parking, I'm supposed to listen to some history in the streaming audio for about 5 minutes before getting out of the car and going over to the huts. The first stop on the tour is the so-called Muhlenberg Huts area. In this approximate area, during that winter when the Continental Army was facing starvation or dissolution, General Washington ordered that the soldiers build wooden huts to live in over the winter, protection from the elements. And apparently something on the order of 2,000 huts were built, housing General Peter Muhlenberg's Army of Pennsylvania and Virginia. So just a few examples are here, which are reproductions approximating what would have been here, along with the stainless steel water fountain that the soldiers no doubt used, and those who came by bicycle had a nice rack to put them there. A city of huts. Welcome to the fourth largest city in America. Arriving in this rural area in the winter of 1777, soldiers immediately began building 2,000 log huts for shelter, earthworks for defense, and rubble roads to keep out of the deep, boot-pulling mud. General Washington issued orders on the sizes and locations of the huts. Soldiers cleared all the trees from the countryside for miles around, dragging back the lumber to build log walls, shingle roofs, and rough bunks and stools. Most of this mighty task was finished within a month, despite shortages of tools. For 6 months, the log city's population rivaled Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. General Washington keeps his station at Valley Forge. I was there when the Army first began to build huts. They appeared to me like a family of beavers, everyone busy, some carrying logs, others mud, the rest plastering them together. The whole was raised in a few days, and it is a curious collection of buildings in the true rustic order. Thomas Paine writing to Benjamin Franklin. There's a popular jogging trail past here. So each of these huts could house anywhere from 12 soldiers to a couple of officers. Now the tour says we should go inside and look around in the huts, but I don't see any that are open. They all seem to be locked. I don't know what this is. Transformation of the American Army. Discipline and training. The large protected valley in front of you is the so-called Grand Parade. Extending from where you are standing to the ridge almost a mile away, it served as the centerpiece of camp. When units from the various states arrived at Valley Forge in December 1777, their officers brought individual experiences and ideas about military operations and maneuvers. These differing tactics had limited the Army's effectiveness during battle. On the Grand Parade, soldiers from all states spent months of daily training learning to act as a unified force. The winter was hard, the differences in experience were vast, and the outcome of the revolution was uncertain. But the result of the soldiers' training on the Grand Parade was that a stronger, more disciplined and professional National Army emerged, with new confidence and a stronger identity as the American Army. Imagine it is May 6th, 1778. Arrayed on the Grand Parade in front of you are 10,000 Continental soldiers. They are demonstrating their new skills for General Washington and a crowd of dignitaries. This is the gala celebration of the new military alliance with France, which has just been announced. Soldiers move into position for inspection. They form battalions and maneuver around the Grand Parade as if on the field of battle. At a signal, 13 cannon discharge at once. Like a wave, running musket fire circles around the Grand Parade. After passing in review, extra rations for everyone. Huzzah! There's a painting by Edwin Austin Abbey. Prussian General Friedrich Wilhelm de Steuben brought European discipline to the Continental Army. From dusk to dawn, his voice was heard above the sounds of marching men as he shouted commands. In simulated battles, he trained them for the eventual campaign they would wage against the British Army. You try not to look too hard at the Caterpillar backhoe when trying to imagine what this looked like back then. Today, a visitor sees Valley Forge as a quiet place with trees, fields, and monuments. While joggers and bicyclists pass by, let's look back at what this place was like in the winter of 1777 and 1778. Imagine the intense activity of the soldiers constructing their huts, practicing maneuvers, and performing all the other jobs of an entrenched army. Some of them man sentry posts, others go on foraging expeditions. The unlucky ones managed the latrines, and some care for the livestock. There is deep, boot-sucking mud everywhere. The noise is constant. While today Valley Forge is full of trees and well-managed fields and grassy areas, in 1777 it was a forest of tree stumps as far as the eye could see, and the air was full of wood smoke. Despite General Washington's orders regarding cleanliness, the reality was a constant strong stench of latrines and animals. The area we are passing on the right was covered with closely packed wooden huts. Several marketplaces have been established where farmers and other civilians sell food and supplies to the troops. At these farmers' markets, the local farmers are encouraged to sell all of their produce to the army, rather than sell any to the British who were wintering nearby in Philadelphia. The winter was not a snowy one, but was very wet due to the frequent rain. Troops laid field stones to make roads that kept them out of the mud. The military city all around extends to the ridges visible in the distance. Valley Forge is crisscrossed with small roads that are historical in nature. One we're approaching right here at the stop sign is Gulf Road, G-U-L-P-H. On December 19th, 1977, over Gulf Road from Gulf Mills, southeast of Valley Forge, Washington's troops arrived. And here I get out of the car at tour stop 3 and take a break from driving and walk up to explore the National Monument Arch more closely. The National Memorial Arch was authorized by Congress in 1910 as a tribute to George Washington and his army who endured the winter encampment at Valley Forge in 1777 through 1778. It was designed by Paul Philippe Crête, a prominent Philadelphia architect. And dedicated on June 19, 1917. Although it had stood for nearly 80 years as a symbol of triumph achieved by Washington, by the mid-1990s the arch was in need of major structural repairs. It was cordoned off and closed to the public for safety reasons. During 1996 through 1997, the Freemasons of Pennsylvania contributed more than $1,500,000 necessary to preserve the arch to its original grandeur. And here in this place of sacrifice, in this vale of humiliation, in this valley, of the shadow of that death out of which the life of America rose, regenerate and free, let us believe with an abiding faith that they to them union will seem as dear and liberty as sweet and progress as glorious as they were to our fathers and are to you and me, and that the institutions which have made us happy, preserved by the virtue of our children, shall bless the remotest generation of the time to come. Henry Armitt Brown. Kind of interesting echo in here. I've noticed that there's a lot of Chinese people, almost exclusively women here. Not just ethnically Chinese, but speaking Chinese. I don't know if they're on part of a tour or if there's a... What's going on with that? It just seems like 9 out of 10 people I encounter are Chinese. This one guy's out here cleaning down his sports car. The charming music on the streaming audio soundtrack is extremely appropriate and enjoyable for driving around here in the park. I would like to keep it playing, but I'm sure I'd get tons of copyright hits for it. Leaving the National Memorial Arch as the road rises up ahead, and just around the bend, there are supposed to be a couple of columns bracketing the road. There they are up ahead. These are known as the Pennsylvania columns. They represent a gateway to the area where troops from Pennsylvania had their camp, noteworthy because in 1777 there were more soldiers from Pennsylvania here than from any other state. This little group of woods here is known as Wayne's Woods, but there's nothing of note to stop and see there, so the tour takes me past it. This equestrian statue depicts General Mad Anthony Wayne, who commanded the troops from Pennsylvania. His temper and aggressive attitude were responsible for his nickname. General Washington remarked that, in Wayne, the spark of daring might flame into rashness, but it was better to have such a leader and occasionally cool him to caution than to be forever heeding the valor of men who feared that they would singe their plumes in battle. Wayne served throughout the war and in this statue he is turned in the saddle, gazing in the direction of his home 5 miles away, known as Waynesboro. This is near the town of Paoli and is not to be confused with the modern southwest central Pennsylvania town of Waynesboro. His familiarity with the local countryside was very valuable to General Washington. After the war, Wayne served as the commanding general of the Legion of the United States, which was the military group that opened up for settlement the so-called Northwest Territory, land today occupied by the states Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Leaving the Wayne statue, as the South Outer Line Drive curves to the right, the large hill ahead and to the right is called Mount Joy. I believe that's Mount Joy more or less straight ahead. In 1777, this area was occupied by troops from Virginia. All of the original 13 states were represented by troops in the Continental Army at Valley Forge. Just past on the right are several memorial markers, one of them erected by the Daughters of the American Revolution and dedicated to those soldiers of the war whose burial sites are unknown. However, historians believe that there are no soldiers of that war buried within the grounds of Valley Forge, and this is a reminder that while Valley Forge was a large encampment, it was not a battleground. The ages of the members of the Continental Army ranged from the youngest being an 11-year-old drummer boy to a 73-year-old veteran of the French and Indian War. Some troops were volunteers, but many had been drafted by their home states. The enlisted men mostly came from lower classes of society, and many had recently immigrated from countries such as Ireland and Germany. Because state laws allowed substitutions, many drafted individuals who had sufficient means simply hired disadvantaged boys and men to take their places. So ironically, in this struggle for American freedom from oppression, much of the burden was thereby shouldered by oppressed people, the poor, indentured servants, and slaves. Like their backgrounds, the soldiers' motivations for serving were diverse. Some served out of coercion or necessity, some from their sense of patriotism, and some for the promise of their own freedom in exchange for service. Along with the boys and men of the army at Valley Forge were about 400 women, most of them being wives of the men. Many were refugees who had been forced from their homes due to the war, and often their children were present as well. These non-combatants were known as camp followers, and they occupied themselves cooking, sewing, doing domestic chores, and looking after livestock, and they often took care of the sick. Although it was inconsistent, they often were given rations and pay for their services, and some even got pensions after the war. Turning onto State Route 252, the route passes to the north along the west edge of Valley Forge. Up ahead, pretty much straight where the road appears to disappear, is a house. This is a farmstead which during the 1777 encampment was much smaller than now and was used as the headquarters of General Henry Knox. It is believed to have been extensively expanded in the 1800s, including the addition of a barn and other outbuildings. Up ahead on the left is a covered bridge, which was built in 1865. The driving tour does not include going over the bridge, but I'm going to go over it anyway, just for the heck of it. It's a one-way bridge and traffic has to wait for oncoming traffic, so I decided to scoot across following a car in front of me while the other guys patiently wait. Now how to get turned around. Alright, I've managed to get turned around a ways down the road and I'm heading back to the covered bridge again. Just beautiful out here. The Valley Forge is really a gem of just a tranquil New England kind of countryside. A beautiful place to hike, walk, jog, bicycle, come out and picnic. Many different uses besides the purely historical. Leaving the covered bridge, we drive along State Route 252, also known as Valley Creek Road, and it enters a narrow gorge through it which runs Valley Creek. The hills on either side of the gorge served as a natural defensive barrier for the encampment. Historically, this creek provided water power for ironworks, textiles, and grist mills. The valley was the site of the Mount Joy Iron Forge, later called the Valley Forge, and the area was later named after it. In 1777, the forge and its many buildings were selected by the Continental Army's Quartermaster Department, which stored many kinds of supplies here, from food to weapons. The forge's owner was concerned that such a stockpile would attract the notice of the British forces, but Quartermaster General Thomas Mifflin assured him that the location was defensible, and the Army would quickly relocate the supplies at the outbreak of any local hostilities. When the British did land on the shore of Chesapeake Bay and began to march northward, the forge owner's doubts over Mifflin's reliability led him to begin moving out the Army's stores as well as his own belongings. The British troops soon arrived on September 18, 1777, and burned the forge and many other nearby buildings, and many crucial supplies were lost in spite of heroic efforts to move them to locations of safety. As the men tried to escape the British by fleeing to the other side of the nearby Schuylkill River, a few were shot and killed. This was the only fighting to take place at Valley Forge during the war. We're now approaching the intersection of State Highways 252 and 23. So this is the end of State Route 252, and I'm now turning eastbound on State Route 23, which is also Gulf Road. But just up ahead here, Gulf Road continues directly ahead, while State Route 23 veers off to the left, and that's the way the driving tour has me going. Continuing down State Route 23, I turn into the access road to the Washington's headquarters area, which is at the site of the former village of Valley Forge. This is right down by the south bank of the Schuylkill River. And we can see that the land slopes downwards towards the right into the shallow valley that the river runs through. Parking is up at the top of the hill. Proceeding downhill on the curvy walkway from the parking area to the site of the village of Valley Forge. As I descend the sloping path, there are good views of the Schuylkill River down in the valley below there. So this is the location of the village of Valley Forge. In December of 1777, this was a small industrial village that was overwhelmed by first having to deal with British troops and now the 12,000-strong Continental Army. The village consisted of a few houses and barns, some outbuildings, fences around barnyards, and orchards. The railroad station we see now was not present in 1777, so from the village there was a clear view of the Schuylkill River. General Washington rented a small stone house to use as his headquarters, and it still stands today. Washington worked, lived, and slept in this house for about 6 months. This small space was shared with as many as 25 people, including his military aides, his wife Martha, and various slaves and servants. The house was a busy place, with couriers and officers constantly coming and going, and visitors wishing to meet with Washington. During that winter, the Revolution was run from the few rooms of this house, but the service and staff thought it was too cramped, so a log annex was erected to provide some additional space. So this is the general area of Washington's headquarters at Valley Forge. Of course, the railroad tracks weren't there then. Just beyond the tracks is the Schuylkill River. A lot smaller here than it is by the time it gets down to Philadelphia. And of course the train station that's there is something that didn't exist at that time. The railroad station that's here is no longer a functioning train station. It's been restored as a museum. And the rails are still in some kind of service, probably for freight, but not for passenger service. So this building that's just appearing behind the train station is General Washington's headquarters building, the house that he had his headquarters. Continuing from what I said before, due to the inefficiency of heating larger structure in those days, Washington's soldiers may actually have been warmer in their accommodations in their log huts than did their commander-in-chief. Martha Washington did not arrive until February 1778. You could have a sign hanging there, George Washington slept here, just like the myriad of other places that have that kind of sign. Nice recreation area. A lot of people out here just to enjoy the countryside without getting too far from civilization. The perseverance of the soldiers at Valley Forge is a beloved American story. Long discussed ideas for commemoration of their sacrifices were implemented after the disruption of the Civil War, when the centennials of both the Declaration of Independence and also the encampment itself refocused attention on unification and the ideals of the revolutionary period. Preservation came about from citizen action and advocacy. Their common vision was for the preservation of a significant place that had inspired the Continental Army, and that continued to inspire Americans a century later. In 1879, a citizens group sold $1 shares to preserve the small house which General Washington had used as headquarters. In 1893, in response to citizen concern about permanence, the Pennsylvania legislature created a state park here, which began to purchase land on which the soldiers had encamped. The states represented at the 1777 encampment were invited to erect commemorative monuments. Individual organizations also honored their ancestors' contributions. Here, the Daughters of American Revolution dedicate a monument in 1911 to soldiers who died during the encampment. To honor the history of the place, the state transformed the farming landscape into a stylized commemorative park with tour roads and monuments. They removed industry, restored encampment area buildings, and planted thousands of trees to create an evocative landscape. It's noted elsewhere on the tour that the wooded area that we see all through here was more or less bare of trees at the time of the Continental Army's encampment here. Of course, there were trees, but they had pretty much denuded the landscape in the immediate vicinity. They chose to provide scenic beauty and expansive views for an emotional connection to history, rather than a dry but accurate restoration of the 1777 landscape. With a groundswell of support from citizen advocates, President Gerald Ford signed legislation making Valley Forge a national park at the bicentennial of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. The tradition of citizen stewardship continues today as volunteers and partners participate in the ongoing work of advocacy, preservation, and interpretation. Always present, Washington's Guard occupied huts here. This special detachment was created to protect the Commander-in-Chief, his official family, and his equipment, supplies, and papers. Washington required that each lifeguard, as they were called, be a native-born American. It was assumed such men would be loyal, as they had a vested interest in the success of the war. Today, this tradition continues in the form of the 3rd United States Infantry, a unit that stands guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington. George Washington faced many challenges over the 8 years of the war. Some of the many issues were a deeply divided Congress with a tendency to micromanage, insufficient and unpredictable funding, disorganized logistics, and many others. While historians argue about whether Washington was a very good military strategist, there is no doubt that his strong leadership during not only the miserable winter at Valley Forge, keeping the Army together and improving it, but also over the entire war, was crucial to the success of the Revolution. Washington's care and concern for the common soldier was evident to all, and this resulted in many of them staying when they could have easily left the Army. His own integrity attracted many of the most capable people in America to serve with him. He was a good judge of character, and he chose talented men to serve under him, and like any good leader, he listened to them and then put them in positions of great responsibility. Many of Washington's senior officers and aides, while often quite young during the war, served capably during that long conflict, and went on to govern the new country for a generation. North of the river, supporting the winter camp, the land just across the Schuylkill River from here played a vital role in the winter encampment. Provisions and armaments from throughout the region were brought here, and the Army built a bridge for access across the river just downstream of this point. The commissary and a hospital were established here, and a farmer's market was set up to sell goods and food to the soldiers. They were encouraged to do so rather than sell to the British. From that side of the river, the Army could better monitor British movements to the north and east. When the camp on this side of the river became too foul, General Washington ordered the Army to move to the north side. After nearly 6 months' occupation, the Army's encampment became increasingly unhealthy as hot weather came on. On June 9th, Washington ordered the Army to move out of their huts to fresh campgrounds with good air and good water. While most of the Army camped in front of the old encampment, Sergeant Jeremiah Greenman from Rhode Island wrote that on June 10th, at the beat of the general struck the tents, marched about a mile, I think it's supposed to be mile, over Schuylkill River and pitched our tents in a field with Providence Township, in Providence Township. So we're leaving the Washington's headquarters area at Valley Forge, going up the hill and crossing State Route 23, and then I think we gotta kind of jog a little bit to the left and continue up the hill. The instructions just say cross 23, they don't say you have to go a little bit left and then a little bit right, but it's more or less apparent. This road, West Interline Drive, climbs the north side of Mount Joy. The first roads we drove on earlier in the video were named Outer Line Drive because they approximately demark the Continental Army's outer defensive perimeter. If the British should have attacked at Valley Forge and the Continental Army was overrun there, they were to have fallen back up the slopes of Mount Joy to this higher inner defensive line, hence this road's name of Interline Drive. While most defensive structures and earthworks seen elsewhere in the park are reconstructions, the ones seen along this road are the remains of the original earthworks dug by Washington's soldiers in 1778. Looking left, the earthworks will appear as a continuous small mound that runs parallel to the road. The soldiers spent endless hours digging the trenches and piling dirt into these defensive structures. General Washington expected an attack by the British at any time. Once again, our route crosses the historic Gulf Road. After crossing Gulf Road, our route now runs on South Interline Drive, and we approach the Soldiers of New Jersey Monument on the right. Completed in 1913, this monument honors the New Jersey Brigade that was encamped on this site, and it is the only monument in the park that features a statue of a common soldier. He is carrying a musket and is wrapped in a blanket, quite probably standing guard and trying to stay warm. General Washington was careful to use military misinformation to exaggerate the number of troops at Valley Forge and the strength of the defenses there, and this resulted in the camp never being attacked by the British. There was never a battle here, but over the winter over 2,000 people died from illnesses, including dysentery, pneumonia, typhus spread by fleas, and typhoid caused by eating food that had come into contact with fecal matter. The close and unsanitary living conditions, coupled with malnutrition and the damp, cold weather, all contributed. Sick soldiers were often moved to army hospitals in nearby towns, such as Yellow Springs, Bethlehem, Reading, and Lancaster. Those that died were buried at sites near those towns. General Washington was outraged over a situation that developed when soldiers recovering from illness could not return to duty because their uniforms had been taken from them while they were recuperating and given to other soldiers, and no replacement uniforms were available due to supply problems. One positive note was that another scourge of the time, smallpox, scarcely affected the troops at Valley Forge. Smallpox had been widespread before the war, although the new practice of inoculation, which had been introduced to the New World by African slaves, was available. Suspicious of the practice, General Washington decreed that the little understood inoculations would not be used in his army, and any officer who dared to be inoculated himself, or to have the men under him inoculated, would be removed from command. However, Martha Washington insisted on getting inoculated herself, and this convinced her husband to eventually order all of his army at Valley Forge to be inoculated against smallpox. During that winter, General Washington solved supply problems by sending many foraging parties into the surrounding countryside, and extending many miles from the camp, even as far as New Jersey and Delaware, to find, buy, or if necessary, commandeer the desperately needed provisions. But then in February, another food and supplies crisis developed. The weather took a turn for the worse, and the Schuylkill River could not be crossed due to high water, and most of the roads in the area of the Valley Forge camp were flooded. The soldiers were without food supplies, and the army was in a near-starving condition. Colonel Alexander Hamilton, who at the time was serving as a confidential assistant to General Washington, wrote that the troops were complaining of going without food for several days, forcing many of them to desert, and in his words, strong features of mutiny began to show themselves. It is indeed to be wondered at that the soldiery have manifested so unparalleled a degree of patience as they have. At the worst point in the crisis, in early March of 1778, nearly 3,000 soldiers were listed as unfit for duty. How to build a redoubt. The earthworks today appear to be giant molehills, but it took complex engineering to construct them. A deep ditch was excavated in front to slow the attacking enemy. The dirt was heaped into gabions, baskets of interwoven branches. Bundles of branches called fascines were piled outside and inside the wall to protect the defenders. Then the entire work was usually covered with sod to absorb cannon fire. Here at Redoubt 3, the inside walls were faced with stakes. Sod was scarce in the mud-churned encampment. Though partially reconstructed, Redoubt 3 is built on remnants of the original site. So that's a picture of what it was expected to look like. And this is what it looks like now. You can see some of the ditching there. And continuing on that way. It's a lot easier to see with the naked eye than to see in the video, I suspect. There's a brush-covered ditch heading down that way, and it keeps going around. The valley between outer and inner line defenses left Americans vulnerable to attacks from the south. Redoubt 3 was built to secure this Achilles heel. Directly across the valley is the outer line, supported by Brigadier General Anthony Wayne's Pennsylvania brigades. Descending Mount Joy, on the right side is Artillery Park, where the massed cannons of the artillery have been assembled. You can see them down straight ahead there, kind of bluish in color. The artillery had some 75 cannons, and they were mostly kept in the central area of the encampment. Note that the cannon on display are reproductions. The artillery was commanded by General Henry Knox, who before the war had been a bookseller in Boston, and while he was well read, his knowledge of artillery was largely self-taught. That such a senior officer had so little in the way of practical military experience was just one of the many challenges faced by General Washington. Knox joined the Continental Army in 1775 and served through to the end of the war. He is most remembered today for having successfully implemented what many regarded at the time as his wild and impossible plan to transport 59 captured British cannon and mortars from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston, a distance of 300 miles, during the winter. The arrival of these weapons at the heights overlooking Boston in January 1776 enabled the Americans to prevail in their siege of the British-occupied city. Knox later took over command of the army when Washington retired in 1783. When Washington became president, he named Knox to become the first Secretary of War in the new federal government. Leaving the Artillery Park parking lot, which is tour stop 7, on East Interline Drive, we will pass a stone marker on the right. The marker shows the location where General Washington had his marquee or tent during the early days of the Valley Forge encampment, while better shelter was being arranged. Part of his leadership style was to not move into better accommodation himself until his troops had roofs over their heads, in the form of the log huts previously mentioned. The marker's right after this tree on the right. And we come to the end of East Interline Drive and cross Gulf Road once again. Now the road becomes known as North Interline Drive. The large field on the right is the Grand Parade, which we saw from the opposite side earlier in this video while driving along North Outer Line Drive near the Muhlenberg Brigade wooden hut display. While much of the area was filled with huts of the troops, there was also the open area where troops practiced military maneuvers. All through the war up to that point, France had provided money and weapons and some assistance and leadership to the colonial army. But when France formally joined with the American states against her old enemy England, providing French soldiers on the ground, the impoverished Americans finally had a much-needed boost in strength. On May 6, 1778, this entire field to the right was filled with an assembly of the entire colonial army in celebration of the alliance. General Washington had a toast with each brigade commander on this joyous day. "Vive la France, and let us drink to His Most Christian Majesty. Huzzah!" At the end of North Interline Drive, we pull into the parking lot for Tour Stop 8, which is about 38-year-old Prussian military advisor Baron Friedrich von Steuben. He had served in the famous Prussian army under Frederick the Great and was a highly experienced military leader. However, in 1763 he was retired as part of the reduction of that army and decided to come to America and offer his leadership services. Coming to serve under Washington at Valley Forge in early 1778, von Steuben was shocked to see how ill-prepared the Continental Army was for resuming the fight against the British in that spring. With Washington's approval, he took over military training of the army. Battles at that time relied on synchronized and coordinated maneuvers, but coming from the 13 states, the soldiers had many different methods of marching and maneuvering. Von Steuben chose and trained a select band of 100 men, who then spread that training throughout the entire army. He standardized the cadence of marching and simplified the coordinated steps of reloading and firing in order to increase speed. He also taught the soldiers to use the bayonet, an essential weapon that they had previously ignored or sometimes used for cooking meat. Von Steuben learned that the American soldiers would not respond to the harsh leadership tactics that were common in Europe. The soldiers often questioned his methods rather than blindly following orders, and he adjusted his training methods accordingly. He spoke no English, so he bellowed his commands in French, and another officer would then translate. When frustrated, he peppered his orders liberally with swearing in German and French, which the Americans had no trouble understanding. The Americans, however, were quick learners, and as spring arrived, entire brigades marched with a new precision and crisply executed maneuvers. Because of von Steuben's training, the Continental Army became a cohesive, efficient, and professional fighting force. Valley Forge is thus known as the birthplace of the American Army. Von Steuben never returned to Europe and lived out his life in America. Heading back to the Visitors Center on Pennsylvania Highway 23, we approach tour stop number 9, Washington Memorial Chapel on the left, but that's not it. It's coming up here shortly. The ornate and patriotic Washington Memorial Chapel was constructed beginning in 1903. The planned cathedral was never finished. However, powerful symbolism is found in the resulting chapel's soaring Gothic Revival architecture. The religious imagery inside incorporates symbols of the Episcopal Church and also the founding of the nation. The stained glass windows include imagery from the life of Christ and of the heroes of the American Revolution. This is an active church where weddings, baptisms, and funerals take place. Since my schedule doesn't allow any more time to visit here at Valley Forge, and I need to get on the road, I don't have time to go inside and see the chapel. Plus, being a Sunday morning, I figured there was probably a service going on and did not want to interrupt that. Leaving the chapel and turning back onto eastbound Pennsylvania Route 23, we will soon pass a memorial on the right. The monument here is for the Revolutionary Patriots of African descent. This was the site where the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, commanded by General James Mitcham Varnum, was encamped. Troop strength was an ongoing concern during the Revolutionary War, since the Army had difficulty with short enlistments, as well as potential soldiers being discouraged from joining due to the promise of the hardships they would face. After arriving at Valley Forge, Varnum convinced General Washington to allow him to raise additional troops of African origin in his home state of Rhode Island. The state promised freedom to any man who served, and about 250 black soldiers formed the new regiment, which was the first of its kind in the American Revolution. Ultimately, almost 10% of the Continental Army was comprised of African American soldiers. There was much ethnic and racial diversity in the Continental Army. Soldiers were allowed to practice their respective religions. Warriors from the Oneida Indian Nation were also here. The Oneida had formed an alliance with the United States, and they sent warriors to Valley Forge to serve as Army scouts. In May of 1778, the French alliance was an unwelcome development for the British perspective. They realized that once French ships started to arrive with weapons and troops, things were going to change in favor of the United States. The British abandoned Philadelphia and started moving towards New York City, their base of operations in America. Many Americans who remained loyal to the British left the country at this time. When General Washington learned of the British plans to move towards New York City, he mobilized the Continental Army, which marched out of Valley Forge on June 19, 1778, 6 months after arriving there in 1777. They pursued the British Army into New Jersey and engaged them in battle at Monmouth Courthouse on June 28th. The next day, the British retreated to New York City. The Continental Army's victory gave the troops a boost and proved that they were now a formidable, efficient, and proficient military force. However, the war was far from over, and indeed would continue for 5 more years, only ending when the British finally surrendered at Yorktown, Virginia. The epic struggle cost over 50,000 deaths between the armies of both sides, not counting substantial civilian losses. The soldiers at Valley Forge endured hunger, discomfort, hard training, sickness, and near starvation, and the extended time away from their homes and families. As a result, Valley Forge has come to exemplify the determination and resilience of the Americans who served there in spite of the hardships, making it possible to win enduring freedom for the new country. 10 years later, during a break in the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, George Washington took time to revisit Valley Forge, the only one of the Continental Army's camps that he ever revisited. He was pleased to see that the wasted landscape that he had left behind was by then returned to productive agriculture. The beauty of the land remains a reflection of the peaceful freedom that he and the Continental Army had won for the new nation. Valley Forge is a beautiful and historical place to visit, and I encourage anyone visiting to purchase the audio driving tour.